On May 2, 1943, 368 Italian soldiers stepped off a train in Colorado Springs, and I remember hearing about it from my cousin, who worked at the depot. Enemy soldiers on American soil, right here in Colorado, where folks thought the war would never touch them directly. The Italians wore faded uniforms and had that look prisoners get, part relief, part fear, not knowing what came next. They were the first prisoners of war to arrive at Camp Carson, 6 miles south of town in the shadow of Pikes Peak. That magnificent mountain rising 14,000 feet above sea level, watching over everything that happened below. Those Italians had no idea they were just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would change Colorado Springs forever. But you won't believe what happened over the next 3 years at that camp. A story about 12,000 enemy soldiers living among us. About hatred turning into something nobody expected. About young German boys who'd followed Rommel across North Africa, ending up in Colorado fields, working alongside farmers who spoke their language. About Christmas concerts and theater performances, and a German newspaper published right there on American soil. And about dark things too, things people didn't talk about much after the war. Violence among the prisoners themselves, Nazis trying to maintain control even in captivity. The story got told in pieces over the decades. My Uncle Jim was a guard there, told me things he saw. Farmers who hired prisoners to work their fields shared stories at church socials. German prisoners who came back to visit in the 60s and 70s came back because they'd found something here they never expected, brought photographs and memories that filled in gaps. And if you put it all together, if you listen to all the voices, you get the whole picture of what really happened at Camp Carson during those war years. Colorado Springs in 1943 was a pleasant town of maybe 40,000 people. Tourist destination, health resort. Folks came for the clean mountain air and the spectacular views. Pikes Peak looming over everything. The Garden of the Gods with those red rock formations. Broadmoor Hotel catering to wealthy visitors from back east. Quiet place. Peaceful. Then Pearl Harbor changed everything. In December 1941, Japan attacked our Pacific Fleet, and America went to war. Suddenly Colorado Springs wasn't peaceful anymore. The city bought land south of town, donated it to the War Department. Construction started immediately. Nearly 12,000 workers building Camp Carson from nothing, named after Kit Carson, the famous scout and Indian fighter. By early 1942, the camp was operational, training facility for American troops. The 89th Infantry Division trained there. Over 100,000 American soldiers passed through Camp Carson learning to fight, preparing for deployment to Europe or the Pacific. Nurses trained there. Tank battalions. Mountain troops with their pack mules, preparing for combat in the Alps. Even a Greek infantry battalion activated at Carson. The place hummed with activity, soldiers everywhere, the sounds of training echoing across the high desert landscape. But in January 1943, something new appeared at Camp Carson. Construction crews building another compound, this one with double fences and guard towers and barbed wire. Prisoner of war camp. Capacity for 12,000 men, largest POW facility in Colorado, bigger than the camps at Trinidad or Greeley. The Army didn't tell folks much about it, just that enemy prisoners would be coming, would be put to work helping with the labor shortage. Farm labor was desperate in Colorado by 1943. Every able-bodied man was either in uniform or working defense plants. Sugar beet fields needed tending, corn needed harvesting. Tomatoes needed canning. Mexican laborers helped some, but it wasn't enough. At an agricultural conference in Salt Lake City in May 1943, the War Department suggested using prisoners of war for farm work. Geneva Convention allowed it for non-military labor. Colorado Extension Service jumped at the chance, so the prisoners started arriving. Those first Italians in May, 368 men captured in North Africa. They'd fought for Mussolini until the Italian army collapsed. Young men mostly, farmers and laborers from southern Italy, conscripts who'd never wanted to fight in the first place. They looked relieved to be out of the war, relieved to be alive, grateful for 3 meals a day and a safe place to sleep. The army assigned them to agricultural work almost immediately. Trucks would collect them at dawn, armed guards riding along, take them out to farms around Colorado Springs. The Italians proved to be good workers, knew farming, understood the rhythm of agricultural labor. Farmers started requesting the same men back, building relationships despite the language barrier. My Uncle Jim said the Italians were easy to guard. Most of them had no interest in escaping. Where would they go? They were thousands of miles from home in the middle of America, surrounded by mountains and desert. They had food, shelter, safety. The war was raging in Europe and North Africa. Being prisoners in Colorado was better than being soldiers in Tunisia. Then something unexpected happened that changed everything at Camp Carson. Today, welcome to this channel and to an authentic World War II story, in which ordinary people were pushed into moments that tested their fear, courage, and humanity. My name is Dr. Franklin J. Carter. I'm 80 years old, a retired military and World War II veteran, and I have been telling war stories for many years. If you are ready to follow me through these stories of war, then kindly like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications so you can see other episodes when they're released. Also, tell me where you are watching from and what exact time you are watching right now. This story is just starting, so sit down and follow me to the end. In July 1943, Mussolini's government fell. The Badoglio coup overthrew the fascist dictatorship and Italy switched sides, joined the Allies against Germany. Overnight, the Italian prisoners became something different, not quite allies, but not quite enemies either. The War Department relaxed restrictions on them, formed them into service units, and let them actively help the American war effort. By late summer 1943, the Italians at Camp Carson were evacuated, sent to other facilities, or back to Italy. The camp sat mostly empty for a few weeks, guards wondering what came next. Then in early autumn the trains started arriving again, and this time they carried Germans. You won't believe what kind of Germans these were. Afrika Korps veterans. Rommel's men, the cream of German mechanized warfare, panzer tank crews and elite infantrymen who'd fought across North Africa from Libya to Tunisia, who'd given the British and Americans hell in the desert campaigns. Disciplined, arrogant, proud, still wearing their faded tan uniforms with the palm tree insignia of the Afrika Korps. Young men mostly in their 20s, but with hard eyes that had seen too much combat. They were different from the Italians. You could feel it immediately. These Germans hadn't given up, hadn't quit. They'd been captured when the Afrika Korps got trapped between Allied armies in Tunisia in May 1943. Surrounded with nowhere to run, forced to surrender or die. They didn't like being prisoners, carried themselves like soldiers still, marched in formation, snapped to attention when their officers passed. Maintained military discipline, even though the war was over for them. The camp population grew rapidly through autumn 1943, more trains arriving every week. Germans by the hundreds, by the thousands. By November, the camp held over 6,000 men. By spring 1944, 9,000. Eventually, the population reached 12,000, the camp's maximum capacity. Largest concentration of German prisoners of war in Colorado, one of the largest in the entire Mountain West. Camp Carson became a city within a city. The POW compound had its own administration, its own rules. Wooden barracks housing 50 men each, mess halls serving 3 meals a day, an infirmary with real doctors and nurses treating sick and injured prisoners, a chapel for religious services. Recreation buildings where prisoners could relax during off hours. Even a canteen where they could buy cigarettes and toiletries with the scrip they earned from working. The prisoners earned 10 cents a day just for existing, money for toothpaste and razor blades. If they volunteered for work, they got 80 cents more per day. Officers earned $20 to $40 per month depending on rank under Geneva Convention rules, though they weren't required to work. The money went into accounts or was converted to canteen scrip. Couldn't buy much, but it gave the men some dignity, some sense they weren't just slaves. And the work was constant. Every morning trucks left Camp Carson loaded with prisoners, heading to farms and factories across Colorado. Sugar beet fields around Greeley and Fort Collins, cornfields near Brush and Fort Morgan, tomato canneries in the Arkansas Valley, logging operations on the western slope. Branch camps sprang up all over the state, temporary housing where prisoners stayed during planting and harvest seasons. The high school gym in Alt, Great Western Sugar Company dormitories in Eaton, National Guard Armory in Brush, old CCC camps in the mountains. The farmers needed them desperately. Most farmers in Colorado were of German descent themselves, immigrants or children of immigrants from the Volga region. They spoke German at home, cooked German food, followed German customs. When German prisoners showed up to work their fields, these farmers could talk to them in their native language, build relationships despite the war. My cousin Sarah married into a farming family near Fort Collins, and she told me stories years later about the German prisoners who worked their beet fields in autumn 1943 and 1944. Young men who'd never seen sugar beets before had to be taught how to thin them, how to harvest them, without damaging the roots. The farmers weren't supposed to fraternize with prisoners, strict rules against personal contact. But how do you enforce that when you're working side by side in a field all day? The Dietz family, Sarah said, would feed the prisoners lunch. The Germans arrived with dry bread and a piece of sausage in brown paper bags, the only food the camp sent with them. Mrs. Dietz couldn't stand watching them eat that, not when she had a kitchen full of food. So she'd call them into the cellar, where they'd eat real meals, hot stew, and fresh bread and apple pie. If guards came around, the prisoners would scatter, act like nothing was happening. Some guards looked the other way, understood that feeding hungry boys was just human decency. Others were stricter, followed the rules exactly. The Lind family didn't hide it at all. Set up long tables in their yard, fed the prisoners and the guards together, everyone eating the same food. The guards were mostly older men, veterans from the First War, or men with injuries that kept them out of combat units. They weren't eager to make trouble over a shared meal. Many of them figured if American POWs in Germany were being treated well, it was partly because America was treating German prisoners well. What you give is what you get. Then something started happening inside Camp Carson that nobody wanted to talk about. Something dark. September 1943 through April 1944, a reign of terror among the prisoners themselves. Nazi fanatics trying to seize control of the camp through intimidation and violence. Hardcore believers in Hitler's ideology who couldn't accept that Germany was losing, who saw any cooperation with Americans as treason, who appointed themselves judges and executioners. You won't believe what those Nazis did to their fellow prisoners. 6 murders. 2 forced suicides, 43 men who killed themselves rather than face Nazi kangaroo courts. A general camp riot, hundreds of localized acts of violence, beatings in the barracks, threats whispered in the night, Germans killing Germans while American guards patrolled outside, not knowing what was happening inside the compound. The pattern was always the same. A prisoner would be accused of being too friendly with Americans, of expressing anti-Nazi opinions, of questioning Hitler's leadership. He'd be hauled before an informal court of Nazi officers who'd appointed themselves judges. No defense allowed, no real trial, just accusations and a predetermined verdict. Then the beatings would start, or the prisoner would be found hanged in his barracks the next morning, made to look like suicide, but everyone knew it was murder. The army investigated every death, tried to figure out what was happening, but the German prisoners operated under a code of silence. Nobody talked. Nobody testified against the Nazis, even though most prisoners hated them. Fear kept mouths shut. The Nazis had power in the camp through sheer brutality, and prisoners knew if they spoke up, they'd be next. My Uncle Jim was working guard towers during this period, and he said you could feel the tension even from outside the fence. The way prisoners moved, looking over their shoulders constantly. The way they avoided certain barracks where the hardcore Nazis bunked. The whispered conversations that stopped when guards came near. Something was very wrong, but the Americans couldn't quite put their finger on what. Then in spring 1944, the army finally got informers. German prisoners who'd had enough, who were willing to risk Nazi retaliation to stop the violence. They identified the ringleaders, the men orchestrating the terror. Intelligence officers at Carson worked those informers carefully, protecting their identities, gathering evidence. By April, they had enough to act. The hardcore Nazis were segregated from the general prison population. 44 men identified as violent fanatics moved to special high-security facilities. Some went to Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a camp specifically designed to hold the most dangerous Nazi prisoners, hardcore believers who'd never stop fighting even in captivity. Others were scattered to isolated branch camps where they couldn't infect the general population. After the Nazis left, Camp Carson changed dramatically. The atmosphere lightened. Prisoners relaxed. Men who'd been living in fear could breathe again. Suddenly they were willing to work, willing to cooperate, willing to make the best of their situation. The violence stopped almost overnight. And that's when the real story of Camp Carson began, when enemy soldiers started becoming something else. Something nobody expected. The prisoners organized themselves into something resembling a community. A little city of Germans in the middle of Colorado, they elected representatives to communicate with camp administration. Set up their own internal governance, handling disputes among themselves according to German military law. Maintained cleanliness standards, work schedules, recreational activities. They created a theater company, built a stage in one of the recreation buildings, constructed props from scrap lumber, and paint scrounged from various sources. Germans who'd been actors or musicians before the war organized productions, wrote scripts, recruited players. They put on variety shows, comedy sketches, dramatic performances. Other prisoners came to watch, escaping the boredom of camp life for a few hours. A prisoner named Carl Zimmer documented everything with a camera he'd somehow acquired. Took photographs of theater performances, orchestras, choir concerts. Images that survived the war ended up in the Denver Public Library decades later, showing Germans in elaborate costumes performing on makeshift stages, audiences of fellow prisoners watching and laughing. You look at those photographs and you forget for a moment these are enemy soldiers, prisoners of war. They look like any community theater group anywhere. They formed orchestras and choirs. Germans have always loved music, and the camp had men who'd studied violin, piano, trumpet, every instrument you can imagine. They borrowed instruments from the YMCA, formed ensembles, gave concerts. Christmas carols sung in German, folk songs from the old country, even some American popular music. The music floated across the camp on summer evenings, and guards would stop and listen, momentarily transported somewhere else. They published a newspaper. DPW Woche, the Prisoner of War Weekly. Germans typed and printed their own news, wrote articles about camp life, included puzzles and cartoons and letters from home. The paper had to be approved by American censors, couldn't include anything political or military, but within those limits the prisoners created their own media. Gave themselves a voice, a way to communicate across the vast camp, a connection to each other. They played sports, soccer matches between different barracks, teams competing fiercely for bragging rights. Baseball, which most Germans had never seen before but quickly learned to love. Volleyball, basketball, track and field. The camp even played exhibition matches against local Colorado teams, Germans versus Americans on the soccer field. Gates closed so spectators couldn't enter or leave until the game ended. But people showed up anyway, curious to see how the enemy played. Classes were organized, Germans teaching Germans about subjects they knew, engineering classes, mathematics, languages, bookkeeping, chemistry. Some prisoners took correspondence courses through the University of Colorado or the University of Minnesota, working toward degrees while imprisoned. Young men trying to prepare themselves for whatever came after the war, knowing they'd eventually go home, wanting to have skills that would help them rebuild their lives. And relationships formed, between guards and prisoners, between farmers and workers, between young German soldiers and the American families whose farms they labored on. Friendships that weren't supposed to happen but did anyway, because humans are humans, regardless of what flag they fight under. There was a guard named Robert Patterson who came to know several of the German prisoners well. He'd see the same men day after day at the work detail staging area, learned their names, picked up bits of German, shared cigarettes during breaks. One prisoner carved him a small wooden figure, incredibly detailed, barely 3 inches tall, an engineer with a surveying instrument. Patterson kept that figure on his desk for the rest of his life, showed it to his grandchildren, used it to tell them about the war, about how people can be enemies and still respect each other. There was a nurse at the camp hospital, Mary Sullivan, young woman from Denver working for the Army Medical Corps. She treated German prisoners with the same care she'd give American soldiers, set broken bones, tended infections, sat with fevered men through the night. The Germans called her Schwester Maria, Sister Maria, treated her with enormous respect. When she walked through the compound, men would nod, step aside, make way for her. She never felt threatened despite being a young woman surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, because they understood she cared for them when she didn't have to. Christmas 1943 was the first holiday with the full camp population, over 6,000 Germans far from home, homesick and depressed. The camp administration let them organize a proper German Christmas. They decorated their barracks with paper chains and stars cut from tin cans, put up a Christmas tree cut from the mountains, decorated it with handmade ornaments, organized religious services, sang German carols, Stille Nacht and O Tannenbaum. Some American guards stood outside the chapel listening to those carols on Christmas Eve. My Uncle Jim was one of them. He said it was one of the strangest moments of the war, standing in the Colorado cold listening to enemy soldiers sing about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Some of those Germans had killed American soldiers just months earlier in North Africa. Some of those guards had lost brothers or cousins or friends to German bullets. But on Christmas Eve 1944, everyone was just homesick boys, far from home, and the carols sounded the same in German as they did in English. Then something happened in spring 1945 that changed everything again, something none of the prisoners expected. Germany collapsed. Hitler dead by suicide in his bunker, German armies surrendering across Europe, the 1,000-year Reich lasting exactly 12 years. The war in Europe was over. Germans at Camp Carson heard the news through their newspaper, through letters from home that painted a picture of total devastation. Cities in ruins, millions dead, the country divided between Soviet and Allied occupation zones. Families scattered, homes destroyed, everything they'd known gone. The prisoners expected to be sent home immediately. War's over, time to go. They packed their belongings, said goodbye to the farms they'd worked, prepared for repatriation. But President Truman had other ideas. He decided to keep German prisoners in America through 1946. Labor shortage was still critical. American soldiers weren't home yet from overseas deployment. Farms needed workers. Factories needed hands. The Geneva Convention technically ended at the war's conclusion, but Truman found legal ways to extend the prisoners' stay. Called them disarmed enemy forces instead of prisoners of war, changed the terminology to change the rules. The Germans were bitter about this. They'd surrendered. The war was over. They wanted to go home. But they had no choice, no power, no voice. So they kept working through summer and autumn 1945, into winter, through spring 1946. Planting and harvesting Colorado crops while Germany struggled to survive across the Atlantic, getting letters from families describing starvation and chaos and desperation, being unable to help because they were stuck in America. Some actually preferred staying. Germany was a nightmare in 1946, divided, occupied, destroyed. Food was scarce, shelter uncertain, the future completely unclear. In Colorado they had 3 meals a day, warm beds, safety. Some, like a young prisoner named Eric Becker, asked if they could stay permanently, immigrate after their release, but American law didn't allow it. All prisoners had to be repatriated regardless of their personal wishes. The work at Camp Carson wound down through spring 1946. Fewer prisoners going out to farms as men were gradually processed for return to Germany. Camp population dropping from 12,000 to 9,000 to 6,000. Barracks emptying out. The little German city dissolving. My Uncle Jim said the last months were strange and sad. Guards who'd spent 3 years watching these men, farmers who'd worked alongside them, nurses who'd cared for them, all preparing to say goodbye. Addresses were exchanged, promises made to write, photographs taken as mementos. Some friendships had grown deep during those years, deeper than anyone wanted to admit. In May 1946, the last large group left Camp Carson, German prisoners loaded onto trains heading east to ports where ships waited to take them home. Back to a Germany none of them recognized anymore. Back to families they hadn't seen in 3 or 4 years. Back to cities that were rubble. Back to lives that needed rebuilding from nothing. But you won't believe what happened years later. How the story continued long after the war ended. Starting in the 1950s, some of those German prisoners started coming back to Colorado. Coming back not as enemies but as visitors, tourists, former prisoners wanting to see the place where they'd spent those war years. They brought wives and children, showed them Camp Carson, drove past the farms where they'd worked, looked up American families who'd been kind to them. A prisoner named Herman Machold came back in 1962, brought his daughter who was studying engineering. They toured what had become Fort Carson by then, walked through areas that had been the POW compound. Herman showed his daughter where his barracks had stood, where the theater had been, where he'd taken classes in mathematics and English. Explained how those years in captivity had been strange and difficult, but also surprisingly positive, how he'd learned things that helped him rebuild his life after the war. 3 Germans who'd been prisoners at Carson actually moved back to Colorado Springs permanently. Married American women, became citizens, bought houses, raised families, integrated into the community that had once held them captive. When people asked why they came back, they'd say they'd found something here, some quality of life or opportunity or memory that drew them. The mountains maybe, or the clean air, or the people who'd treated them fairly when they didn't have to. Over 5,000 Germans who'd been held at Camp Carson eventually returned to the United States after the war. Not all came back to Colorado, but many did, bringing their American stories back to Germany, telling families and friends about their time as prisoners, about how they'd been treated, about relationships they'd formed. Those stories spread through Germany in the 1950s and 60s, became part of German understanding of America, contributed to post-war reconciliation between former enemies. The camp itself was mostly dismantled after the prisoners left. Some buildings were sold at auction, moved to other locations. The land became part of Fort Carson, the training facility that still operates today. The POW compound area was bulldozed, rebuilt as soldier housing and administrative buildings. By the 1960s, almost nothing remained of the prisoner of war camp that had housed 12,000 Germans for 3 years. But memories remained, stories passed down through families. Photographs in attics and drawers. That wooden figure Robert Patterson kept on his desk. The canteen buildings that ended up in Colorado Springs, repurposed for other uses. Letters between former prisoners and American families that continued for decades. Evidence that something unusual had happened here, something that transcended the simple narrative of captors and captives. Camp Carson wasn't unique. There were prisoner of war camps all over America during the war, over 500 of them, holding nearly 500,000 Germans. But each camp had its own story, its own character, its own particular mix of tension and cooperation, brutality and kindness, hatred and unexpected friendship. Camp Carson's story was remarkable because of its size, because of the relationships that formed, because of what happened after the war when prisoners came back. The larger story is about what happens when you put enemies together for years in circumstances that force them to coexist. About how hatred can soften when you work alongside someone day after day. about how seeing enemy soldiers as individual human beings with families and hopes and fears changes your understanding of war itself, about how the simplest acts of kindness, a shared meal, or a carved wooden figure, or a nurse's gentle care, can build bridges that outlast conflict. My Uncle Jim used to say the hardest thing about guarding prisoners at Camp Carson was maintaining the emotional distance required by regulations. You weren't supposed to befriend them, weren't supposed to see them as anything but the enemy. But how do you do that when you see the same faces every day for 3 years? When you watch them work and laugh and grieve letters from home? When you realize they're just young men caught up in something beyond their control, just like your own son or nephew serving overseas? The farmers felt it too. They'd request the same prisoners back, week after week, season after season, because those Germans had learned their farming methods, understood their land, could be trusted to work without constant supervision. Relationships formed through shared labor, through the universal language of planting and harvest, through the satisfaction of crops brought in before winter came. German and American farmers discovering they had more in common than what divided them. And the prisoners felt it. The ones who weren't hardcore Nazis, which was most of them, found themselves in a strange situation. Enemy country treating them better than their own army ever had. Fed well, housed decently, paid for their labor, allowed to maintain dignity. Working on farms that reminded them of home, eating food prepared by women who reminded them of their mothers, sleeping in real beds instead of foxholes. The cognitive dissonance must have been overwhelming, being treated humanely by the people they'd been trained to hate. Some struggled with it, felt guilt about cooperating, about finding any comfort in captivity while their comrades still fought and died in Europe. The hardcore Nazis exploited that guilt, used it to maintain power through shame and accusation. But after those Nazis were removed, after the violence stopped, most prisoners made their peace with the situation. Decided that surviving with dignity was better than suffering pointlessly out of misguided loyalty. The theater performances and concerts and sporting events were part of that adjustment. Ways of maintaining humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Ways of saying we're still Germans, still proud of our culture, still connected to who we were before the war made us soldiers and prisoners. The camp administration encouraged these activities, understood that keeping prisoners occupied and engaged meant fewer discipline problems, less likelihood of escape attempts or violence. And there were escape attempts, though fewer than at other camps. Colorado's geography made escape difficult, mountains and high desert in every direction, nearest neutral territory hundreds of miles away in Mexico. A few prisoners tried anyway, cutting through fences at night, making runs for freedom. All were recaptured within days, brought back, punished with solitary confinement and loss of privileges. The attempts were almost ritualistic, expected, prisoners feeling obligated to try even knowing they'd fail, maintaining some sense of military honor by attempting escape. One attempt became legendary at the camp, happened in winter 1944. A group of about 20 prisoners spent 3 months digging a tunnel from one of the barracks toward the perimeter fence. Classic prisoner of war escape scenario, dirt hidden in trouser legs and dispersed gradually around the compound, tunnel shored up with wood from shipping crates, entrance hidden under a movable bunk. They got within 15 feet of the fence before the ground settled, and a guard noticed the depression. When they excavated, they found an impressive piece of engineering, over 70 feet of tunnel about 3 feet square, ventilated through a pipe made from soldered tin cans. The camp commander called in the diggers, expected to throw them in solitary, but instead he commended them for their engineering skill. Said the tunnel showed initiative and German precision, that he respected the attempt, even though it had failed. Then gave them extra work details instead of harsh punishment. That response became legendary among the prisoners, evidence that Americans understood military honor even between enemies, that there were rules both sides respected despite the war. The relationship between Camp Carson and Colorado Springs was complicated. Townspeople knew German prisoners were there, saw them being trucked to work sites, heard stories from farmers and guards. Some people objected, thought the prisoners were being coddled, getting better treatment than they deserved. Newspaper editorials occasionally complained about enemy soldiers eating well while American civilians rationed food, about Germans getting medical care while doctors were in short supply for civilians. But other townspeople understood the practical reality. Prisoners were solving the labor shortage, keeping farms productive, helping the war effort in their own way. They weren't a threat, carefully guarded, strictly controlled, and generally cooperative. Their presence meant Colorado crops got harvested, food got canned, timber got cut. The alternative was watching crops rot in fields while young American men fought overseas. The choice was clear, even if emotionally complicated, and some townspeople found themselves sympathizing with the prisoners despite the war. Seeing them marching past in their faded Afrika Korps uniforms, young faces looking tired and homesick, hearing them sing in the evenings from the camp, reading in the newspaper about their theater performances and soccer matches, realizing these were just boys caught up in Hitler's madness, not monsters, not fanatics, just ordinary young men who wanted to survive and go home. That sympathy created tension. How dare you feel sorry for the enemy? How can you sympathize with soldiers who killed Americans? The tension played out in social settings, churches and social clubs and family dinners, arguments about whether Germans deserved kindness or only strict justice. The war made everything complicated, made simple human compassion feel like betrayal. My Aunt Ruth worked as a secretary at the camp hospital, and she said the medical staff struggled with that tension constantly. They were trained to heal, to relieve suffering, but these were enemy soldiers they were treating, Germans who'd fought against America. Yet when a sick prisoner came in with appendicitis or pneumonia or a broken bone, what were they supposed to do? Let him suffer? Refuse treatment? Their medical ethics wouldn't allow it, so they treated Germans with the same skill they'd use on American soldiers, and sometimes felt guilty about it even though they knew it was right. The war created impossible ethical situations. German prisoners working American farms, while American prisoners starved in German camps. German soldiers eating 3 meals a day in Colorado, while German civilians starved in bombed cities. American families rationing sugar and butter and meat, while German prisoners got adequate nutrition. The contradictions were everywhere, unavoidable, maddening. Then in spring 1945, reports started coming from Europe about concentration camps being liberated, about the full horror of what Germany had done, the systematic murder of millions, the mechanized genocide, the brutality beyond comprehension. Americans at Camp Carson struggled to reconcile those reports with the young Germans they saw every day, ordinary boys who seemed incapable of such evil. Were these the same people? The same nation? How do you process that kind of cognitive dissonance? Some guards became harsher after the concentration camp reports, less willing to show any kindness to Germans. Some farmers refused to request prisoner labor anymore, couldn't stomach the idea of cooperating with people whose nation had committed such crimes. The attitude shifted, hardened, became less sympathetic. Germans were the enemy again, fully, completely, without nuance. But others maintained that the individual prisoners at Carson weren't responsible for Nazi atrocities, that most of them had been conscripts fighting for their country without knowing the full extent of what their government was doing. Condemned the crimes while maintaining compassion for individual soldiers. Held both thoughts simultaneously, the way you have to during war when everything is morally complicated and nothing is simple. The German prisoners themselves reacted to concentration camp reports with shock and denial. Many claimed not to have known, insisted it was Allied propaganda, refused to believe their nation capable of such things. Others admitted they'd heard rumors but hadn't known the scale, hadn't understood it was systematic policy. A few, very few, had suspected all along, but had been powerless to do anything. The conversations in the barracks must have been agonizing, Germans arguing among themselves about collective guilt and individual responsibility and how they'd face their families after the truth came out. Camp Carson became a microcosm of the larger post-war reckoning Germany would face. How do you acknowledge evil done in your nation's name while maintaining your own humanity? How do you move forward after discovering your government committed genocide? The prisoners at Carson had the rest of 1945 and into 1946 to struggle with those questions while still in captivity, still separated from the full reality of what Germany had become. Then the trains started taking them home. Group after group processed for repatriation, loaded onto trains heading to East Coast ports, shipped back across the Atlantic. The camp population dropping week by week through spring 1946. By June, only a few hundred remained, waiting for final transport. By July, Camp Carson's POW compound sat empty, guard towers unmanned, barracks abandoned. The German city in Colorado was gone, dissolved like it had never existed. Only memories remained, and stories, and photographs, and the wooden figures some prisoners carved and gave as gifts. Only the relationships built over 3 years of unexpected proximity, maintained through letters across an ocean. Only the knowledge that for a brief time during the worst war in human history, 12,000 enemy soldiers lived among us, and we discovered they were human after all, which was both comforting and disturbing because it made war more complicated than we wanted it to be. That's the story that needs remembering about Camp Carson, that complicated truth about enemies and captives, and the possibility of connection across the deepest divides, that reminder that even in war, humanity persists in unexpected ways if we let it, a truth that resonates across all the decades since those years when German boys worked Colorado farms and sang Christmas carols in the shadow of Pikes Peak. The farmers who worked with those prisoners never forgot them. Decades later, sitting in church or at family gatherings, they'd tell stories about the young Germans who'd helped harvest their crops. About Hans, who knew more about engine repair than any American mechanic in town. About Friedrich, who could thin sugar beet fields faster than anyone they'd ever seen. About Joseph, who carved little wooden toys for their children, left them as gifts at the end of each workday. My cousin Sarah's father-in-law, Old Man Dietz, kept a photograph until the day he died. Black and white image of 6 German prisoners standing in his beet field, tools in hand, squinting against the sun. He'd point to each face and remember their names, tell stories about their personalities, their quirks, how they'd adapted to Colorado farming after growing up in Bavaria or Saxony or Prussia. Talked about them like old friends, which I guess they were in a way, though he'd never admit it in those terms because admitting friendship with the enemy felt like betrayal. The guards felt it too, that strange combination of duty and human connection. My Uncle Jim said the hardest day at Camp Carson was the last day, June 1946, when the final group left for repatriation. He'd watched some of those men for 3 years straight, knew them by name, understood their personalities, their backgrounds, their hopes for after the war. Saying goodbye felt wrong somehow, like closing a book before you knew how it ended. He wondered if they'd make it home safely, if they'd find their families alive, if they'd manage to rebuild lives in the ruins of Germany. Years later, Jim told me he'd received letters from 3 different former prisoners, men who'd tracked down his address through military records or contacted the farm where he'd worked. They wrote thanking him for fair treatment, for small kindnesses, for treating them like human beings instead of like animals or numbers. Those letters meant something to Jim, validated his instinct that even during war you could maintain basic decency. He kept them in a box with his other war memorabilia, medals and photographs and official documents, evidence that his service meant something beyond just guarding enemies. The city of Colorado Springs changed forever because of Camp Carson. Population boom, construction explosion, thousands of soldiers and prisoners, and support personnel flooding a small tourist town. After the war, the city never shrank back to what it had been before. Fort Carson remained active, became permanent military installation. The economy shifted from tourism and health resort to military town, defense contractor hub. The war transformed Colorado Springs from peaceful mountain retreat to bustling city, and Camp Carson was central to that transformation. Some buildings from the POW compound survived for years in various locations around Colorado. Barracks purchased at auction moved to farms as storage sheds or worker housing. The mess hall that became a community center in a small town north of the Springs. Guard tower sections repurposed as hunting stands or fire lookouts. Physical reminders of what had been there, though most people didn't know the history, didn't understand these were pieces of a prisoner of war camp that once held 12,000 Germans. By the 1970s, almost all physical evidence was gone, demolished or rotted away, or rebuilt beyond recognition. But the memories persisted in the people who'd been there, who'd lived through those years when enemy soldiers lived among us. As those people aged and died, the memories transferred to children and grandchildren through stories, became family history, became part of Colorado's complicated relationship with World War II. The German prisoners who returned to visit brought their own memories, their own perspectives on what had happened. Hermann Mackhold wrote about his time at Camp Carson in letters to German newspapers in the 1960s, describing his captivity as difficult, but ultimately positive, explaining how Americans had treated him fairly, how he'd learned skills that helped him after the war. Other former prisoners contributed to German documentation of POW experiences, academic studies, historical records. Their stories filled in details Americans never knew, gave the complete picture of life inside the compound. Some former prisoners admitted they'd been better fed and housed in American captivity than they'd ever been in the German army. Said the irony wasn't lost on them, being taken care of by the enemy while their own government had treated them as expendable. That realization contributed to post-war German disillusionment with Nazism, helped shift German culture toward democracy and peace. The POW experience wasn't the only factor, but it mattered. Thousands of young German men learning that the enemy wasn't what propaganda had claimed, that Americans valued life and dignity even for prisoners. The impact on American attitudes was harder to measure, but equally significant. People who'd worked alongside German prisoners, who'd seen them as individuals rather than as faceless enemies, carried that experience into the post-war world. When hatred toward Germans threatened to become permanent, they remembered Hans and Friedrich and Josef. When people wanted to treat all Germans as war criminals, they remembered the scared boys who'd worked their farms and carved toys for their children. That complicated the narrative in important ways, prevented collective demonization, maintained space for reconciliation. If this story surprised you, if it made you think about things you hadn't considered, then give the video a thumbs up. Share it with somebody. Tell your friends. Tell your family. These stories matter. They're part of who we are. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more stories like this. I'm committed to researching deeply and also telling you what I witnessed during World War II. And if you've got stories of your own, stories about that war or any other time, write them down. Tell them to somebody. Don't let them disappear. History isn't just what's in books. It's what we remember, what we pass along, what we refuse to let die. My Aunt Ruth said she learned more about human nature during her 3 years at the Camp Carson Hospital than in all her nursing training. Learned that nationality and politics and war are abstractions, but suffering and healing and kindness are concrete. That a German soldier with appendicitis is just a man in pain who needs help. That treating him well doesn't mean approving of Hitler or excusing German war crimes, it just means acknowledging shared humanity. She carried that lesson into her entire nursing career, treated every patient with dignity, regardless of who they were or what they'd done, because Camp Carson taught her that everyone deserves basic decency. The Colorado Extension Service estimated that German prisoner labor saved the state's agricultural economy during the war years. Without those 12,000 men working fields and processing plants, crops would have rotted, harvests would have failed, food supplies would have collapsed. The economic value was immense, probably saved billions in modern dollars, kept Colorado farming viable until American soldiers returned home and could resume normal agricultural work. But the human value was incalculable. Those unexpected relationships between captors and captives. Germans and Americans, enemies forced to coexist, who discovered common ground despite everything that should have kept them apart, proving that even in the darkest times, humanity persists in small, unexpected ways. That war doesn't completely destroy our capacity for connection and compassion, and that's the truth, Camp Carson.